want to be a part of it. New York, New.
If I can make it there, I'll make it anywhere. It's up to you, New York, New York.
Hi, I'm Brian Havens, and welcome to another episode of The Straight Edge. Every day in urban areas, trees are cut down for various reasons. Disease, age, hazard, or sometimes they just get blown down in a storm. Unfortunately, most of this wood ends up at the junkyard or in fireplaces. This time on The Straight Edge, we'll see how we can reclaim such wood for turning. So stick around. When it comes to reclaiming urban lumber for turning, one man's trash is truly another man's treasure. And aside from a small investment in some tools and supplies, it's pretty much free for the taking. You might be surprised to find out just how much and what species of wood are destined for fireplaces in the junkyard. And many of these species you won't find at your local wood supplier. And turning wood when it's green is simply a lot of fun. Just look at those linguini shavings. Now, the first time I tried to reclaim some urban lumber, it was an absolute disaster. I had found an unusually large pear tree that had to be taken down due to disease. I got it home, slapped some sealer on the end grain, and threw it in the backyard to dry. About a month later, I went to check on it and found it had cracked pretty much all the way through. This is really unfortunate because pear wood is an absolutely beautiful wood. Hopefully in this video you can learn from my mistakes so you can avoid the same trauma that I had to go through. Before diving right in, however, let's take a moment to look at some of the tools and supplies we'll need to prepare our logs, as well as some extra safety precautions. First, we'll need a chainsaw to cut up the logs. An electric chainsaw should be fine for this kind of work, and they're relatively inexpensive. I got this one for about $100. You can always add a gasoline chainsaw later on. I find that although I've added a gasoline chainsaw to my repertoire, I still like to have the electric around for small jobs. Whether you have a gasoline chainsaw or an electric chainsaw, you'll need some bar and chain lubricant, some wood sealer for sealing the end grain, and since people do put screws and nails into trees, you want to have a metal detector. And finally, safety equipment. At a bare minimum, you want to have some leather gloves, a face shield, and hearing protection. And now a word on chainsaw safety. Chainsaws can be particularly dangerous, so be sure to read and understand the manufacturer's instructions on how to operate your chainsaw. And be particularly wary of kickback. Kickback occurs when the tip of the chainsaw makes contact. When this happens, the chainsaw will thrust quickly and violently back towards the operator. I also have one additional chainsaw safety tip that I haven't seen mentioned elsewhere yet. It can be tempting to align your face with the bar and chain so that you can monitor your progress as you cut. The problem with this is that it puts your face in the line of fire should kickback occur. Instead, keep your face to the side of the line of fire. That way, if kickback does occur, it'll kick back to over your shoulder instead of into your face. You can still monitor your progress, by stopping the chainsaw, taking a look at your progress, and then moving your head back out of the way. Now that we have that out of the way, we can get down to business. There are 3 essential steps that take us from log to final turning. The first step is to prepare the logs by cutting them into turning blanks. The second step is to turn those blanks into rough form and then set them aside to dry. And third, once the blanks are dry, we need to remount them on the lathe and do our final turning. We'll start out with the first step by contrasting what a professional wood turner would do with what a hobbyist would do. A professional wood turner will cut the logs into blanks straight away and rough turn the whole lot within a day or 2. This is indeed the best course of action, but it's not always a practical option for hobbyist turners with time constraints. But we need to do something right away in order to buy time until we have an opportunity to rough turn everything. To understand why time is of the essence here, we need to understand what happens to a log when it's cut from a tree. From the moment that a log is removed from a tree, it begins to lose moisture and shrink in 3 different directions. Longitudinal shrinkage is shrinkage along the length of the log. Longitudinal shrinkage is relatively small and not worth worrying about. It's about 0.1% on average. Radial shrinkage is shrinkage from the outside of the log towards the center of the log. At about 4% on average, this is a moderate amount of shrinkage. Still, this is far from our biggest problem. That's because in radial shrinkage, as the diameter of the log gets smaller, air around the log can take the place of the volume that's been lost due to shrinkage. This brings us to by far our worst offender, tangential shrinkage. Also known as circumferential shrinkage, this is shrinkage along the growth rings. Tangential shrinkage causes us most of our headaches for 2 reasons. First, it's a whopping 8% on average. That's a lot of shrinkage. Second, unlike radial shrinkage in which we had air behind this shrinkage to take the place of the volume, tangential shrinkage is all wood pulling on wood, and something's got to give. This is what causes that familiar starburst kind of cracking that we see on logs all the time. Fortunately, there are several things we can do to prevent or at least minimize cracking until we can find the time to do some rough turning. The first thing we can do is apply some sealer to the end grain to slow down the shrinkage. If you're absolutely strapped for time, this will slow down the shrinkage, buying a few days, maybe a week, until we can take further action. As soon as we can make time, however, there are some preliminary cuts we can make to the logs that will relieve the stresses caused by shrinkage. The first method is to simply split the log in half down the middle. And for more stable species of wood, this may be adequate. In addition to giving us 2 bowl blanks, splitting the log in half will relieve the stresses caused by tangential shrinkage. Here you can see this piece of white oak has shrunk quite a bit, but because we've relieved the stresses caused by tangential shrinkage, we don't have any cracking. We can still do a little better, however, by avoiding the pith. The pith is the very center of the log and is highly unstable and prone to cracking on most species of wood. We can eliminate the pith from our bowl blanks by making 2 slices, one down either side of the pith. I call this the double split. This is my standard practice for preparing bowl blanks from logs. The bowl blanks that you'll get from doing a double split are only slightly shallower than the bowls you would get from a single split. The question remains, what do we do with the center section? Clearly we'll have to cut away the pith and discard it. But if you look closely at the sections on either side of the pith, what we have are 2 quarter-sawn boards. These quarter-sawn boards are quite stable and useful pieces of wood. Here you can see such a center section that's completed drying. At first glance, it looks like the board has warped quite a bit. However, if we focus on the two quarter-sawn pieces on either side of the pith, we can see that the wood has remained quite stable and straight. If, like me, you also use flat wood, you can integrate these pieces into some of your other woodworking projects. If you're exclusively a turner, you can slice up these quarter-sawn pieces into some extremely stable spindle blanks. And finally, if you haven't done so already, apply a coat of sealer to the end grain on all of the blanks.
It dries.
Now that we've hedged against shrinkage and cracking, we can turn our attention to roughing out the blanks. Before mounting the blank on the lathe, it's a good idea to do some extra trimming. Most turners perform this step on the bandsaw, but if you don't have a bandsaw, you can do a pretty good job with a chainsaw and a little practice. In fact, I do most of my trimming with a chainsaw. My bandsaw is usually tied up with other things and it's not worth the time that it takes to reconfigure it. For bowl blanks, I usually start by nipping off all of the corners, and if necessary, nipping off some of the longer sides. And most importantly, for bowl blanks, be sure to nip off the corners on the bottom of the bowl. For bowl blanks, we should be left with a face that looks like an octagon, and where we nip the corners off the bottom of the bowl, it should form a curve that is similar to the curve where the bark is remaining. To mount the blank on the lathe, I'll often use a screw chuck, but for larger bowl blanks, nothing beats the safety and security of a faceplate. I'll also opt for a faceplate if the surface of the bowl blank is relatively uneven. Green bowl blanks can be extremely out of balance, so be sure to start the lathe on a very low speed and work your way up. And here's a tip. When bringing up your rough bowl blank to speed, stand to the side. That way, should something happen, you won't be in the line of fire. Be careful with your first few passes. You'll be cutting a lot of air and you won't have much surface for the bevel to ride on. If you find the first few passes difficult, try pinning the gouge to the tool rest to form a fulcrum and make several scooping cuts. As the blank comes into balance, you can return to your regular pull cut. Once we've trued the blank and removed the parts that we don't want, we can define our basic profile. And since we'll have to remount the bowl in the chuck to hollow out the inside, we'll need a tenon. A couple of passes along the face to true it up. All that's left now is to hollow out the inside of the bowl to match the profile on the outside. Since the roughed out bowl blank will warp after it dries, we want to leave some extra thickness. A general rule of thumb is to leave the thickness of the wall 10% of the diameter of the bowl. In this case, the diameter of my bowl is 7.5 inches wide. To find 10%, simply move the decimal place to the left one place. In this case, we get 0.75, or 3/4 of an inch. You can also find a wall thickness chart in the notes for this video on my website. And now that we know our wall thickness, we simply need to hollow out the bowl. Make sure the wall thickness is the same all the way from the rim to the base. An uneven wall thickness could cause the roughed out bowl to crack when it dries. And here's a tip. The shavings from the green wood still have a lot of moisture in them, and they'll rust your lathe bed out in no time, so make sure you clean it up right after you finish roughing. I also like to spray a coat of WD-40 right afterwards as well. The last step in roughing out a bowl blank is to prepare it for drying. Now here there's quite a few options. Some turners like to put the bowl into a brown paper bag. Others like to coat it completely with anchor seal. One thing that's been working well for me is to cover the back side of the bowl with brown paper bag and store it face down. Supposedly what this does is cause the blank to dry from the inside out, keeping the bowl compressed, thereby reducing cracking. Whether that's the case or not, I've had pretty good luck doing this. Again, there's quite a few options here, so feel free to experiment. Once we've prepared the roughed out bowl, we can set it aside to dry. It usually takes about 6 months for a roughed out bowl to dry. That might seem like a long time, but before you know it, you'll have a constant queue of rough turnings ready to go. Once our roughed out bowl is dried for 6 months, we can remount it and finish turning it. You'll probably notice that your roughed out bowl is no longer round but rather oval. Before we can true up the rest of the bowl, however, we first have to true up this tenon. For shallower bowls, I simply hold the bowl against the chuck and hold it in place with the tailstock. I'm not concerned about marring the inside of the bowl at this point, since we'll be cutting it away later. If the bowl is too deep to mount directly onto the jaws, you can create a small jam chuck. My jam chuck screws into the worm screw that came with my 4-jaw chuck. You could also turn a tenon into the back side of the jam chuck and mount it directly into the jaws. Now we can true the tenon. Since the bowl at this point is only being held on by pressure, be sure to make light cuts. With the tenon trued up, we can now flip around the bowl and mount it into the chuck. With the bowl remounted in the chuck, we can now true the outside of the bowl and refine our final profile. And after truing up the rim, we can focus on truing up the inside of the bowl and taking the bowl down to its final thickness. From this point on, there's no difference between having started with green wood and having started with wood that was already dry. A little sanding, a little more sanding, a little more sanding, and still some more sanding. All that's left now is to clean up the foot. To do this, I like to mount it back into my jam chuck. Only this time I'll put a piece of neoprene between the bowl and the jam chuck to keep it from marring. You can also use a piece of rubber or some leather. Again, be sure to make light cuts when you have the bowl mounted this way, since the bowl is only being held in place from pressure from the tailstock. Also be careful not to apply too much pressure from the tailstock. The bowl is at a pretty thin thickness at this point, And the last thing we want to do is crack the bowl after all the hard work we've put into it. And just when you thought we were finished sanding, with the bowl mounted this way, we can only get so far. I'll have to clean up this little nub at the workbench. Always great fun making those linguine shavings. Now, although we've only scratched the surface on this topic, especially in the area of all the different ways you can cut a log into turning blanks, I hope this video will provide you with a good foundation with which to start. I'm Brian Havens. Thanks for watching. For more information on reclaiming urban lumber and turning green wood in general, look for this video on the video page at my website. This time on the straight edge, we'll learn how to use some of that. My notes fell. Now, although we've only touched the scrap, especially in the area of how many different ways we can